This is MacVoices TV. Welcome to MacVoices TV. This is the Talk of the Mac community, and I'm Chuck Joyner. Folks, this is the first of a two-part interview with Mr. Jeff Carlson. Why a two-part, you might ask? Well, Jeff has been busy. He has written two, not one, but two new books. The first one is Meet the iPad and iOS 5, and that's what we'll be covering now. And if you are interested in that, great, stick around, and you really should be. But the next part, which will be released separately, Jeff is the author of Photoshop Elements 10 for Windows and Mac OS 10, Visual Quick Start Guide. So we'll be talking about that separately since they're such widely diverse topics. And with that, I give you Mr. Jeff Carlson. Jeff, it's great to have you.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, this is fun. Two books at once, Jeff. That's pretty impressive.
Well, it's sort of like movie schedules where, some actor has movies come out at the same time. In this case, it just happened to be the timing of when things were released. So, in the case of this book, which was it's a $2 ebook available at the iBook store, when it finally became clear when iOS 5 would be shipping, I got a semi-frantic call from my editor at Peach Pit saying, we need to do something about this. And it's, there would have been no way that I could update my full book, my full iPad Pocket Guide for iOS 5. And for various, publishing reasons, they're not ready to put out a new paper version of that. And, because when it came to iOS 5, what we knew about it was that it would come out in, fall of 2011, and that could be kind of whenever. So, we had some indications following along the betas and things like that, but, it isn't until Apple finally says this is going to be the date that it comes out that you can really, act on it. So in this case, my editor, he said, we need to do something. We really want to update this Meet the iPad book, and can you get it to us right away? So I was like, well, yes, I suppose I can. I definitely wanted to do it. The timing wasn't great, but the timing is never great. So that's just how some things go. And it was also a really good reason for me to, seriously jump into iOS 5. Whereas before I'd installed the beta on, a test iPad, but I was in the middle of finishing my Photoshop Elements book. So I hadn't really touched on it at all. So it was fun to say, okay, this is what I'm going to do right now to get this project done. So it sort of in a long weekend, maybe a few more days than a weekend, just trying to cram as much as I could into this little introductory ebook.
I love to talk to authors about the same subjects because it doesn't matter how they do it, just by the nature of their personality, what they think is important, or their writing style. They end up authoring two very different books. They deliver a lot of the same information, but it's not the same way. And so I have to ask you, what approach did you take to because it feels like two different subjects, or maybe you could meld it into one if it was someone that had just purchased their iPad right as iOS 5 came out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's because since the iOS powers the iPad, and also because since the iOS 5 was a free update to anybody running an iPad, it seemed natural to be able to cover to update the information that was in the previous ebook, which was just called Meet the iPad 2, and really focus on some iOS 5 things, which for someone who's just bought an iPad, or for someone who is just upgrading, the whole startup sequence is different, because iOS 5 is set up now so that you don't need to sync to a computer. You don't even have to own a computer. to run an iOS 5 device. And so, the whole startup sequence, it asks you, to enable location services and a bunch of details like that before, in iOS 4, you get your brand new iPad and you just basically get this graphic that said, hook this up to a computer, and you couldn't do anything with it. So, that's an example of, how iOS 5 is different from, what we had before, and why covering the iPad and iOS 5 it made sense to kind of squish them together and into this new title, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And, I confess, even though we've been talking about this now for a while, I need to wake up a little because I've had my iPad too, so I didn't have to activate it from scratch. And we've been talking about, oh boy, post-PC, we don't have to connect it to the computer anymore. I didn't even think about the fact that if you're a new iPad owner, that's exactly it. It's going to be a very different experience than those of us that have had the iPad or iPad 2 for a while.
Right. And you're also presented with a lot of decisions that you didn't have to deal with before. So, for example, do you want to back up your iPad to iCloud? Do you even want to use iCloud? I mean, it's definitely designed for iCloud, but if you haven't yet upgraded your computer so that it will run with iCloud, so if you don't have the latest version of macOS 10 Lion, then you may not be able to take advantage of that, and it's walking you through some steps where you have to make those decisions as you go. So I think somebody who may not have been as obsessive about what new features there are as those of us who write about it, they might be getting installing their iOS and then all of a sudden having to make these decisions like, okay, yes, I do want to use iCloud, it sounds great, but maybe they're not aware that they can't do that. So I try to answer those questions so that people aren't surprised and don't end up frustrated because they have their shiny iPad, and it's not doing what they expect it to do.
Yeah, and of course now iOS 5's rather obsoletes all previous editions of iPad books, including yours. That's why you need to look at this, because I mean, not just from an operational standpoint, but you're right, completely from a startup standpoint. Is it safe to say that you had to go through the process? You wiped an iPad, installed iOS 5, and then just started from scratch. Was that your methodology?
Oh yeah, a few times. I mean, it worked out really well. That I still have my original iPad, and so that became my test machine rather than the iPad 2 that I usually use. And so yeah, it was restoring things from scratch and seeing what happens. Like I'd have to look in the book, but if you, I'm trying to think of the example, if you were deciding to sync via Wi-Fi versus USB, I think there was like a different path. I'd have to look it up, and I'm sure you don't want to just have some video of me going, let me read my book, but just trying to account for the different options that were going to come up, even before you got to the home screen, and then talking about, a lot of the basics that someone who, either is brand new to the iPad or just bought an iPad will encounter.
Okay, so I'm going to take a cue from that and just ask you, in your experiences with playing with this, do you have any thoughts or recommendations on backing up your iPad to the cloud and on Wi-Fi versus a USB sync? Anything that, I mean, there are a few things, battery life obviously probably jumps out and a few other things, but anything that surprised you?
Nothing that's really surprised me yet, and I'll knock on wood and hope that there are no gremlins or gotchas. I think that Wi-Fi sync is great. If you've ever been, you know, feeling that you are shackled to your computer, or some people just don't bother syncing because their computer's in another room and they keep their iPad in the living room or something like that. And so maybe you get around to syncing it, maybe you don't, and like on a day-to-day basis, that's not really an issue, but that means you're also not getting backed up. So what's great about Wi-Fi syncing is that as long as you plug your iPad into a power source, it'll do a sync and a backup over your wireless network just like that. And in fact, unlike the previous versions, while you're getting synced, it doesn't sort of freeze everything. I mean, before you'd have like your syncing screen, and you just kind of have to wait for that to finish. Well, here, there's just a little syncing icon up in the menu bar that lets you know that you're syncing, but you can still use it. So that's just it's extremely handy. You don't have to even think about, well, you can think less about backing up than most people probably do, which is a good thing because then you're still getting backed up. And let's see what else. Oh, you can also you don't have to be connected to power for the wireless sync to happen. If you dig down in settings, you can actually trigger that. So that's also helpful.
I want to stop you there because that's news to me, and that's something that, because of my personal circumstances, I'm kind of very happy to hear about, that I don't have to be plugged in, but it will only activate if I'm on my Wi-Fi network.
Right, exactly. So
wonderful.
I'll just find it real quick. If you go into settings and then general, there's an option now called iTunes Wi-Fi Sync. And if you have set this up, either at during the initial startup phase, or you can set this in iTunes. If you choose Wi-Fi sync as your sync method, then there's a button that just says sync now, and you can tap that and it'll automatically, or you can tap that and it will start a sync. The advantage of the power approach is just that it's a way to automatically do it without you having to actually manually go in and touch it. So it's really handy. Like I found just personally, it's been handy. Let's say I have, I'm on my iPad and I notice in the App Store that there are 5 or 6 updates, and I'll download those updates, and then I'll have my iPhone. And a lot of those apps will also be on the iPhone. Well, I don't want to re-download them on the iPhone to update them, so I can just do a wireless sync with both devices. Do the iPad first, and then do the iPhone, and those updated versions go from the iPad to the computer to the iPhone. So that's like one little handy bit.
We're back to something Joe Kissel and I have talked about, I believe. I think it's Joe that wrote the syncing book, the Take Control of Syncing. And that is that you really have to stop and think a little bit about what sync means. That you're moving back and forth. And in this world, I think, especially with iCloud, there is no longer necessarily a master machine. It's not going to be your Mac that you plug into. It really is going to be now. This iOS 5 thing has almost become an entity unto itself that you just access from different nodes.
Yeah. I think. It's funny. Going on to the next part of your question with like iCloud backups. Like for me personally, I still like the idea of my MacBook Pro as the sort of central repository, mostly because it's my work computer. It has a lot of storage. It's the thing that I sync all of my devices to, and so for that reason, I've opted to just go ahead and use iTunes as my backup source. But if I wanted to, or if I just had an iPad, then or like let's say I have an older computer that can't run Lion, and therefore can't take advantage of some of the iCloud stuff. Then I could use iCloud as my backup source, and in that case, it goes. All of your data just gets backed up to the cloud. Excuse me, not all of your data, but your personal data and preferences and things like that get backed up over the cloud.
And I apologize. I've just looked it up. I believe it's Michael Cohen wrote the syncing book. So
Yes,
sorry,
Michael.
Sorry, Michael. Joe writes so many that it's he gets credit
It's
for stuff
true.
he doesn't write. So obviously you're going to cover syncing. You're going to cover iCloud backup and iCloud use. What are some of the other things? I guess from a new iPad user perspective, because it's really what this is designed for. Do you touch on?
So some of the other things that I touch on include some of the new multi-touch gestures, which are available on the iPad 2. So, for example, we're familiar with multi-touch and being able to direct the interface with our fingers. iOS 5 adds the capability, if you swipe up with 4 or 5 fingers, you get the multitasking bar that shows you what apps have run recently. And you can also change the brightness setting or the volume from there. One sort of clever and I don't know, it's almost natural gesture now is that if you're in an app and you want to go to the home screen, pretty much what you could still do and always did do was just press the home button, or you just take 5 fingers and pinch them like this, pinch them together, and that just immediately brings you back to the home screen. And when I first heard about that, I was like, well, you don't really need that because you've got the home button right there. But when your hands are on the screen and you're interacting anyway, I don't know, it's more fluid and natural to just do that little close motion to exit an app. And it sort of surprises me how easily I've picked that up. And another great thing is that you can use 4 or 5 fingers, and swipe left or right, and just switch between your recently used apps. So you don't have to even do that dance where you're in an app, you go back to the home screen, you launch another app, or you're in an app, you go to the multitasking bar. You're saving a bunch of taps by just saying, excuse me, just saying, okay, I'm reading my Twitter stream. I know I want to go to mail. All I have to do is just do one, side-to-side swipe, and there I am. So I talk about that. Some of the stuff that hasn't changed in the book that's very good for new users is just, making sure that you're getting on a Wi-Fi connection well, giving the basics on, connecting to a 3G network if you have a 3G model. So, some of those essentials that once you know about it, it just becomes second nature. But if you don't know about it, you can kind of scratch your head and go, okay, like, why do I have to dig through, some settings screens to get to this?
The touch interface is, I mean, I love it. I've become accustomed to it. I'm constantly surprised there are things that I don't realize or don't know. I'd forgotten, though, because I think in the old version, iOS 4, you had to install something, and I can't remember now what it was, but you had to buy and install or download this ridiculously large file to get that, and now it's built into the OS. And it evolves, like you say, the 4-finger swipe. I mean, I would almost encourage new iPad owners to just pick one motion per day to learn, because if you try to learn them all at once, you can start to get confused, and it can maybe seem a little daunting. If you do one a day, in the space of a week, you're going to have all the basics mastered and probably be ahead of a lot of current iPad owners who've had them for a long time.
Yeah. I mean, the whole idea behind multi-touch is that you can, figure it out just by interacting with it. I'm sure we've all seen videos of, 1-year-olds picking up an iPad for the first time and being able to figure them out. And it's true. And also the other side of that, which is a lot of kids now will sort of expect that interactivity from things. I'm sure I probably mentioned this example before, but and I think anybody who has small kids knows, like my daughter, when I show her a picture on the back of my camera on the little LCD screen, just to like show her something that I shot, like she'll reach up and try to flip to see the next picture, because of course that's how it works, because that's how the iPad works. So why not? So, but things like a four-finger swipe or doing the pinch thing, those aren't things that you immediately think of to do. And so being able to pick up on that, like I guarantee you, if you're using your iPad and you're with somebody who may have an iPad and is maybe just bought it or doesn't know about it, do the pinch thing or swipe to another app, and like their eyes will bug out because they'll be like, how did you do that? So, which is always kind of fun too.
Yeah, that's the geek in all of us saying, I know how to do it and you don't.
I know how to do something and I can teach you.
Yeah, if you're really nice to me.
Exactly.
Yeah. But you're right. You wouldn't know what to do right away, but once you do it once or twice, then suddenly it's well, of course, that's the only way you would do that. How else?
Right.
How else would you move to the home screen? How else would you move between apps if you're going to do it in a touch fashion? Apple's done a great job of that, and I also feel like they've kind of brought us along. First we had just a few gestures, then we had a few more. They don't inundate you necessarily, especially if you're a longtime user, so that there's not this huge shock of, oh my God, I have this new interface to learn.
Right. And like you don't have to become a master of arcane actions or symbols. I mean, if you go way back to the early personal computers, the problem was, like, if you even wanted to use one, you needed to have this internal database of different text commands just to do anything, and the Mac helped get over that, but there's still lots of things on the Mac that that most people may not know about, that can speed things up, or access preferences or whatever. And so the same goes on the iPad, only the iPad is more deliberate about just being as natural to interact with as possible, I think. A couple of other things that are new, that people may not realize. For example, you can split the keyboard on an iPad. So if you're like me and you want to use your thumbs to type, most people don't have the reach from with their thumbs to hit the middle keys. So you can split that keyboard apart so it has a half on each side, which actually is a lot easier to use, and you can also reposition it up or down the page. It's totally not obvious, but once you know about it, it can be really helpful.
What I was going to ask, given what we've talked about here, do you think that the iPad, well, one of my pet peeves right now is people are looking and saying, can the iPad really be a replacement for a desktop or a laptop?
Oh yeah.
And I don't want to get into that debate because I really don't think it's time yet, no matter how advanced the iPad is. But
yeah.
That said, do you feel like that untethered, that if you didn't own a Mac, if you didn't own a PC, and if you didn't have huge powerful computing needs, which you probably don't if you don't have one yet,
right?
Is this truly a post-PC device that can connect you with the world adequately?
I think it is, because let's sort of assume what an average person will be doing with it. And yeah, that makes a lot of assumptions, but people want to be able to communicate with it. So they want to be able to get their email, which you can do. They want to be able to access the web, and it has a world-class web browser that does everything but run Flash, which that's an old ongoing debate, but in my view it's a good thing. It lets you take advantage of text messaging. So iMessage is a new feature of iOS 5, and typically you think of sending text messages or SMS messages on your phone, because that's like a cellular company feature. Well, there's no reason that it has to be just on your phone. So as long as you have iOS 5 and somebody else has iOS 5 on their device, you can send easy little text messages back and forth. You don't have to be on a phone, which I think is going to be rather huge. I mean, I would love to be able to send my mom a quick text message every once in a while. She lives in California. I live in Washington. I don't need to always compose a full email or get on the phone or do a FaceTime call. I just want to send her a little tiny blip, and I can do that now, and she doesn't have to have an iPhone. So that's really handy. So I think all of the communication bases are covered. You can do, word processing, spreadsheets, sort of those business tasks, and there are some limitations. But again, if you're needing to do more than the basics, then you probably want to have a Mac anyway, or a Windows PC. You would need that power in other ways. And then I think the other aspect is sort of your play and recreation, where you can watch movies, you can read books, you can watch television. There are apps that let you watch television right on there. One of the cool new features in iOS 5 is that if you have an Apple TV, you can use AirPlay to play videos. That part actually isn't specific to iOS 5, but what you can do is you can mirror your video from your iPad to your big screen TV that has an Apple TV attached. So, for example, let's say you want to, quickly, show off a slideshow, or you want to show somebody how to do something, and having people crowd around an iPad might not be ideal in that situation. Or you want to watch TV using the ABC app or the Hulu app. Normally you can't, normally that's limited to just the iPad, but if you mirror that to your big screen TV, you can watch the video there. So all of those bases, the communicating, working, playing. I don't know if I've missed any other significant bases, but you can do them all either with what's built into the iPad or with apps that you can get from the App Store.
Jeff, I didn't prepare you for this, but to wrap this up, and I don't know if you covered this in the book, but I'll ask you to cover it here. For the brand new iPad owner who's never had one before, give me 3, 4, 5 apps, whatever you think is appropriate. The very first ones they should go to the App Store and download that are going to either show off the iPad's capabilities or get them up and running and kind of get them into the iPad culture quickly.
I think one of my favorite apps continues to be Instapaper, which is the best way to describe it is if you want to. That's not the best way. That's the quiet way of describing it. The best way of describing it is to when you run across an article or something else online, something generally text heavy, and you don't have enough time to actually read it. So let's say someone sends you a link to an article in email, or you read something on Twitter, you open it up in your web browser. You want to read it later, basically, rather than trying to either bookmark that site or figure out, somehow remember that you wanted to go there. You can easily tap a button and have that sent to Instapaper, and that gives you two advantages. One, you can use the Instapaper app to view all the articles that you've saved to read later and bring them up. And the second advantage is that those articles are all formatted so that you are just looking at the text and the images. You don't have ads, you don't have pop-ups, you don't have all the cruft that shows up on a lot of web pages. You just have the article in a readable font that you can adjust and go from there. Safari under iOS 5 has some of those features. You can take advantage of the Apple's Reader feature that will sort of do the same thing when you're on a web page, so you can make a more readable version of it. And there's also a read later feature. I can't remember what Apple calls it now, but for my experience, I've always enjoyed the way Instapaper does it. So that's at the top of my list. You can probably tell that I'm a heavy user of Instapaper. I think I use the Kindle app a lot just for reading books and such. I know that kind of falls under the same, and I'm just looking to see here what I have.
I told you folks, I didn't prepare him for this, so he's got to cheat a little bit.
Okay. If you want something that's going to blow people away, this is even better if you are musical, but even if you're not and you want to just like impress people, get Apple's GarageBand app for the iPad, because I can't remember, it's like $5, and it will let you make music if you have no idea how to make music. And it synthesizes instruments. You can build compositions using pre-made loops. You can just fire it up and get out all your frustrations on the virtual drums if you want. It's really cool and really impressive. And I think if you do any photography, there's a program called Snapseed, and there's also another one called Photogene that give you really excellent controls for editing your images. I mean, it's not full-blown Photoshop. It doesn't try to be full-blown Photoshop, but if you want to go in and just like beef up the colors or make something black and white, or do I think like 90% of what you would use Photoshop for or Photoshop Elements for, you can do with those apps directly on the iPad. So I think it's
a pretty good starting set.
Yeah, it's a good start. I also I use Twitterific to follow Twitter, and I think if you want to sort of show off the graphics capabilities, download Real Racing 2 HD, which is you are driving a race car and the graphics are amazing and it's a lot of fun. And if you have an Apple TV, you can wirelessly use the iPad as a controller, and the game actually appears on your TV in full 1080p resolution. It's really geeky fun.
This is Jeff Carlson, folks, who has way too much time on his hands.
You would think so.
Yeah, I'm visualizing you sitting there, at home doing real racing. Well, Jeff, it's and you said it's only 2 books. It's in the iBook store.
Yeah, it's in the iBook store. It might also be on the Kindle store. I haven't checked. But it just came out the same day that iOS 5 was available. $2. I think it's like 75 pages in iBooks. Yeah.
So this is going to be the perfect thing, folks. If you are getting someone an iPad, a new iPad for a gift or maybe even for the holidays, this is one of the first things you should get them to help them get it set up correctly, let them take full advantage of it right out of the box.
Definitely.
Jeff, that's Meet the iPad and iOS 5, the new ebook, I should say, from Peach Pit. I really appreciate it, and we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with part 2 in a separate episode of MacVoices TV to talk about Photoshop Elements book.
I'll go put on a different hat.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Folks, I'm Chuck Joyner. He is Jeff Carlson, again, the author of Meet the iPad and iOS 5 from Peach Pit. I'll have links in the show notes to everything Jeff does, obviously to the book, and to all the apps and everything he just recommended. Until the next time, meeting the iPad and iOS 5 is the talk of the Mac community. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.
MacVoices TV is part of the MacVoices Group and a member of Mac Level 10.